Opening the center immediately, this pawn grab stakes a claim and prepares for rapid piece development, aiming for early central influence. Establishing a solid pawn chain, immediately contesting the center, this move promises a rich positional struggle. Developing the knight to its most natural square supports the central pawn and prepares for castling, setting up a solid foundation. Embracing classical development, Black prepares to challenge White's central pawn with a solid, unhurried pawn structure. Unleashing the bishop to f4 immediately stakes a claim on the long diagonal, subtly eyeing the weakened light squares around Black's king. Challenging the center directly with c5 immediately creates dynamic play and opens up lines for piece activity. Solidifying the center with a flexible pawn structure, preparing development and potentially opening lines for attack. Asserting central presence, Black immediately challenges White's bishop and prepares to develop further, aiming for active piece play. Boldly challenging the center, this pawn thrust immediately seeks to unravel the pawn structure and gain central control. Developing knights to their natural squares offers Black a solid foundation for a flexible setup, preparing to contest the center's dynamic landscape. Establishing central control and preparing for pawn advances is the immediate agenda, with the knight now eyeing the advanced c5 pawn and potentially aiming to reinforce the d4 strongpoint against further Black central pressure. Disrupting the center's pawn structure is a bold choice, creating an immediate imbalance and a chance for White to seize a space advantage. Black sacrifices central control, hoping to gain an open file for piece activity later, but must be wary of White's central pawn majority and potential for a quick kingside assault. Opening the e-file now sets the stage for an aggressive central push, potentially pinning down Black's king's safety later if pieces align well. Probing the queenside pawn structure with the knight, e4 immediately questions White's bishop on f4 and creates a dynamic outpost, threatening further disruption. Reclaiming central space while simultaneously preparing to challenge Black's knight outpost on e4, this bishop's repositioning establishes a strong diagonal influence and sets the stage for potential pawn advances or coordinated piece play. Fleeing the immediate pin on the knight, Black repositions the bishop to pressure the queen's side development. This maneuver introduces dynamic play, forcing White to consider counterplay on the queen's side or defend their centralized pieces. The game now hinges on White's response to this unexpected challenge, potentially unlocking new avenues for attack or defense. Fortifying the queen's rook, the defender of the c-file, this move subtly shores up White's central control while preparing for potential skirmishes along that crucial open file, simultaneously eyeing Black's exposed queen's knight. Unleashing the queen towards the queenside creates immediate pressure, eyeing that undefended a2 pawn and potentially forcing White's rook on c1 to abandon its post, thereby loosening control of the open c-file. This aggressive thrust injects dynamism, challenging White's pawn structure and demanding a sharp response to maintain the equilibrium. Asserting pressure along the queenside, this maneuver intends to exploit the slightly loose queenside structure that Black has allowed, potentially targeting the pawn on b7 or forcing further concessions. Abandoning the pawn opens up White's queen and bishop on the queenside, creating an immediate tactical opportunity. This exchange sacrifices a central foothold, but seeks to disrupt White's developing harmony and potentially exploit vulnerabilities in their pawn structure. Observe how the unleashed diagonal now points towards White's king's position, demanding careful attention. Reclaiming the central square with the bishop, this move creates immediate pressure on the d5 pawn and begins to untangle White's pieces, aiming to capitalize on Black's slightly awkward queen placement. Discarding positional soundness for immediate aggression, g5 launches a pawn storm with reckless abandon, aiming to disrupt White's coordinated pieces and threaten the king's flank. Focusing on the unleashed diagonal towards Black's king, this bishop redeployment sacrifices a tempo to reinforce the queen's security and prepares to meet Black's aggressive pawn thrust by maintaining a more solid pawn structure, potentially aiming for a future queenside expansion once the immediate pressure subsides. Unleashing a pawn storm, Black boldly advances the g-pawn, seeking to dislodge white's active bishop and potentially create a kingside menace, although this aggressive pawn thrust does weaken black's own king further. Introducing a dynamic knight to the center, this maneuver immediately challenges black's advanced kingside pawn structure and forces a decision regarding the vulnerable d4 pawn. The knight's presence on e5 exerts pressure, potentially pinning the f6 knight if black isn't careful, and creates a strong outpost that could prove difficult for black to dislodge without significant positional concession. It's a bold statement, injecting immediate tactical possibilities into a position that was, moments before, a bit more positional in nature. Capturing the knight untangles black's pieces and opens a diagonal for the queen, but it also creates a slight structural weakness around the king as the pawn shield is partially dismantled. White now has a choice: recapture and maintain a compact center, or sidestep and maintain pressure on the d-file. Consider the implications for piece activity and potential mating threats in the coming exchanges. The repositioning of the knights fundamentally alters the tactical landscape. Clearing the central path, this pawn thrust directly confronts black's bishop, forcing a difficult decision and potentially opening lines for white's heavy pieces. A bold assertion of central influence, sacrificing material for immediate activity. By exchanging the bishop for the knight, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create dynamic play. The immediate consequence is the opening of the c-file for black's rook, potentially targeting the weakened queenside. Furthermore, white's king may find itself exposed as the defensive screen thins. This gambit signifies a willingness to embrace a more aggressive, tactical battle rather than a quiet positional struggle, betting on the initiative to outweigh the material deficit. The resulting pawn structure for white will be fragmented, offering black targets to exploit as the game unfolds. Unleashing a pawn majority on the queen side, white aims to create a formidable attacking phalanx, aiming to cramp black's position and exploit the open b-file for future infiltration. Black's pawn push on b6 establishes a defensive wall for the queen's bishop and prepares to develop it, but it also creates a permanent weakness on the c6 square, which white's queen and knight can now target, potentially leading to a positional advantage for white by controlling key central squares and restricting black's piece mobility. Castling brings the king to relative safety behind a pawn shield and prepares to connect the rooks for future action. Black repositions the bishop to the robust diagonal, eyeing the queenside and preparing to connect rooks. Relocating the bishop to d3 fortifies the queenside, creating a more robust defense against potential black advances along the c-file and preventing any clever bishop insertions into c2. Disrupting the bishop pair's harmony with this pin forces white into a potentially awkward decision, threatening to unravel their carefully constructed pawn shield protecting the king. Shifting the queen to b1 subtly prepares a centralizing maneuver, potentially eyeing the c4 square or supporting a future push on the queenside, while simultaneously defending against any immediate threats to the rook on c1 and implicitly questioning black's ambitious pawn storm. Sacrificing material for initiative, black plunges into a complex tactical landscape, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and open lines. The exchange of the knight for the pawn, while seemingly a material loss, aims to create immediate threats and exploit white's slightly awkward queen placement and uncastled king. This gambit injects a surge of dynamic energy into the position, forcing white to defend precisely and consider the consequences of bringing the queen into such an active but potentially exposed role. Suddenly, white decisively seizes the open file, creating immediate pressure against black's queen and disrupting its cozy position. This bold capture not only recovers material, but also opens critical lines for white's rooks to coordinate and exploit the central weaknesses black has carelessly allowed to develop. Seizing the open file with the queen injects immediate chaos, but the looming weakness on the king side, particularly the exposed g-pawn and undeveloped dark-squared bishop, might prove a critical vulnerability as the pieces begin to simplify. The knight's daring flight to b5, forcing the queen to retreat, suddenly injects a powerful attacking dynamic into the position, aiming to exploit the structural weaknesses created by black's recent pawn advances and isolate the queen. Sacrificing material to disrupt the opponent's development and create active counterplay is a bold maneuver. Seizing the initiative after the queen's sacrifice, white's queen now dances to a more aggressive square, forcing a king move and preparing to exploit the open files that will soon be black's undoing. The black monarch, having abandoned its protective pawn shield, now finds itself exposed on the f8 square, a precarious perch vulnerable to even minor white incursions along the d-file or potential discovered attacks. The king's exposure is the primary target, initiating a swift assault on its precarious sanctuary. The king's retreat acknowledges the immediate danger posed by the bishop's check and prioritizes survival, albeit at the cost of abandoning the central squares and surrendering any hope of active counterplay in the immediate vicinity of white's aggressively placed bishop. Fending off the immediate threat, this retreat opens lines of communication for the white queen.